The morning air at the airport was thick with the usual mix of excitement and tension. Travelers were hustling through the terminal, some with coffee in hand, others dragging suitcases behind them. The sounds of announcements echoed off the walls, and the hustle of a busy airport was in full swing. Amid the crowd, a woman walked with purpose, her suitcase in tow and a slight frown on her face. She was heading to a business meeting and had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The flight was on time. Everything was in order. But little did she know, her day was about to take a turn she would never forget. She reached the security checkpoint, where a man in a blue uniform was standing. He looked up as she approached, greeting her with the usual question. "May I see your ticket and ID?" She handed him her boarding pass and ID, ready to get through the security checkpoint as smoothly as possible. There was nothing about her that suggested trouble. She had been through security countless times before and knew the routine, but this time the officer seemed to linger over her documents longer than necessary. She noticed the shift in his posture, the way his eyes moved from her ID to her face, then back to her documents as if trying to decipher something. "Where are you traveling to today?" the officer asked, his tone polite but with an edge of suspicion. "Just a business trip," she replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm heading to Chicago for a conference." The officer nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes told her something was off. He asked a few more questions, ones that seemed to dig deeper than what was necessary for airport security. Questions about her purpose for traveling, her company, and even whether she had any family in the city she was visiting. The questions seemed irrelevant, even intrusive. Yet she answered them with patience, not wanting to escalate anything. Around her, the line moved smoothly. Other travelers, mostly white passengers, passed through without much more than a quick check of their IDs. But this officer wasn't done with her. He continued to scrutinize her papers, his gaze lingering just a little too long on her face. The woman's unease grew, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, hoping that this would end soon. Her fingers tightened around her suitcase handle, but she didn't say anything. She had been through this before, a subtle questioning, an invisible scrutiny that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She had learned over the years to keep her head down, to stay polite, and to not make a scene. It wasn't the first time she had felt like she was being treated differently because of her skin color, but today, for some reason, it felt more blatant, more uncomfortable. "Are you traveling alone?" the officer asked, breaking her thoughts. His tone had changed, now sharper, like he was testing her. She nodded, trying to stay composed. "Yes, I'm traveling alone today." The officer looked at her with a raised eyebrow, as if questioning whether he believed her. It was as if her traveling alone was somehow suspicious. She had heard similar remarks before, but this time it felt different. The officer was no longer just doing his job. He was making her feel like she didn't belong there, like she was an outsider in a place that should have felt routine. That's unusual for someone like you," the officer muttered under his breath, but loud enough for her to hear. His words sent a wave of discomfort through her. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" She froze for a second. The statement didn't make sense, and yet it echoed the familiar sentiment she had grown used to over the years. The idea that somehow she didn't belong. She tried to push the feeling away, telling herself that it was just an isolated moment. But the truth was, it wasn't. It had happened before. She had faced suspicion simply because of her race, her age, and the assumptions people made about her. The officer seemed to pick up on her unease and, instead of apologizing or letting the conversation go, he doubled down. "Is there a reason you're traveling alone?" he asked, his voice laced with an undercurrent of judgment. It was as if he was implying that someone like her couldn't possibly be trustworthy or capable of traveling independently. Her heart raced. She wanted to speak up, to tell him how inappropriate his questions were, but she didn't want to cause a scene. She knew how quickly situations like this could escalate, especially in a public place like an airport. It wasn't the first time she had felt singled out, but today it felt more intense. Her patience was starting to wear thin. "Is there something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. The officer didn't respond immediately. He looked at her for a long moment before his lips curled into a thin smile. "Just making sure everything checks out," he said, though his tone made it clear that he wasn't doing it out of genuine concern. The woman bit her lip. She had dealt with microaggressions and prejudice before, but this felt different. It wasn't just a comment or a look. It was a direct challenge to her right to be there. She had come to the airport like everyone else, with a valid ticket, a purpose for her trip, and a desire to get through the process as smoothly as possible. But instead, she was being treated like a suspect, as though she didn't belong. Her mind raced. Should she confront him? Should she escalate the situation and risk making things worse? She glanced around. There were other travelers, but none seemed to be paying attention. It was as though the officer had managed to isolate her in that moment, making her feel like the only person in the room. It was exactly the kind of situation she had feared, the kind where no one would stand up for her, and she would have to bear the weight of the discrimination alone. Just then, she heard a familiar voice behind her. It was her husband, who had been waiting for her near the gate. He must have noticed that she was taking longer than usual to get through security and had come to check on her. He didn't know what was going on, but he could tell from her body language that something was wrong. He walked up to her, a calm but firm presence beside her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The officer looked up at him, not quite sure what to make of the interruption. "Is everything okay here?" her husband asked, his voice even but sharp, as if he already knew something wasn't right. The officer hesitated for a moment. Clearly not expecting anyone to SAs, the supervisor made her way over to the scene. The woman could feel her nerves tightening. She had been through countless security checks before, never once expecting something like this to happen. But now, standing there with her husband by her side, she felt both supported and exposed. It was strange how quickly one moment could change everything. What was supposed to be a simple security check was now turning into something bigger. The officer, still standing beside them, seemed to know that he was losing control of the situation, and the atmosphere felt charged with tension. Her husband's hand rested on her shoulder, a comforting gesture, but even that didn't ease the nervous energy building up inside her. She had never been one to create a scene, and she had always tried to stay calm when situations got difficult. But today everything felt different. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being judged, and the hardest part was that she couldn't understand why. What had she done to deserve this kind of treatment? She had followed the rules, been polite, and answered the officer's questions. She hadn't raised her voice or acted in any way that might have warranted such scrutiny. Yet here they were. The supervisor arrived, a woman in her early 40s with a calm and collected demeanor. She was dressed in the same uniform, but her presence immediately felt more authoritative. She looked at the officer first, then at the woman and her husband, her gaze lingering for a moment as if taking in the whole situation. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, her voice steady but with an underlying tone of curiosity. The officer, clearly uncomfortable now, spoke up immediately, recounting the events leading up to their arrival. "She seemed a little off," the officer said, his words trailing off. "I just asked a few extra questions, that's all. I'm just doing my job." The supervisor nodded, but her expression remained neutral. "Extra questions?" she repeated, glancing at the woman. "I see. And why do you think that was necessary?" The officer hesitated, glancing at the woman, then her husband. "I'm just trying to make sure everything's in order," he said, his voice growing defensive. "It's not uncommon to ask questions if something seems unusual." The woman's husband didn't let the officer's response slide. "Unusual? What's unusual about my wife traveling alone?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "There's no reason for her to be treated like this, not when everyone else is passing through without a second glance." The supervisor looked at the officer for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then she turned her attention to the woman, her gaze softer now. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. We will make sure this is addressed. You're free to go." The woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least this part of the ordeal was over. But it was hard to shake the feeling that things weren't right. The apology from the supervisor felt like a bandage over a wound that hadn't fully healed. The officer's behavior had already left its mark. She wanted to believe that this would be the last time something like this would happen, but she knew that wasn't realistic. In the back of her mind, she understood that incidents like this were far too common. It wasn't just one bad experience. It was a pattern. Her husband's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, a silent support. They didn't say much as they made their way through the rest of security. The crowd in the terminal seemed unaffected by what had just happened. The woman couldn't help but notice how people moved quickly through the checkpoint, their faces blank and uninterested in the unfolding drama. She realized how many times she had done the same, moved on with her day, never once considering the small moments of injustice that might be happening around her. She had always tried to ignore the uncomfortable truth that, in some ways, she had been conditioned to accept this kind of treatment. Once they were clear of the checkpoint and on their way to the gate, her husband turned to her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She didn't answer right away. The weight of the situation had hit her all at once. Her chest felt tight and her mind was still racing with everything that had happened. "I don't know," she finally said. "I feel like I'm in a dream, you know? Like none of it was real. But then it was. It was real and it happened to me." Her husband nodded, his face showing concern. "I know. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But you handled it with so much strength. I'm proud of you." She smiled weakly, appreciating his words. But there was still a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. The officer had seen her as different. He had treated her like she didn't belong, as though her presence was somehow suspicious simply because of the way she looked. The supervisor's apology had been quick, but it didn't take away the sting of the moment. The truth was, the officer's actions were just a reflection of a larger problem. She couldn't erase the feeling that her entire identity had been reduced to an assumption in that one interaction. They reached their gate, but neither of them was ready to sit down and relax just yet. The woman could see that her husband was still processing what had happened, just as she was. She had always known that incidents like this could happen, but she had never been the one in the center of it. And now that she had been, she realized how helpless it made her feel. No one else seemed to notice the weight of the moment, and no one else seemed to care. It was just one more thing to brush under the rug, one more incident that would be forgotten by the world as soon as they left the airport. But for her, it wasn't something she could just forget. She had been made to feel like an outsider in a place that should have been neutral. She had been singled out simply for being who she was. She wanted to believe that the supervisor's quick apology meant that the system would change, that things would be different from now on. But in her heart, she knew the reality. The system didn't change just because one person apologized. The problem ran deeper than that. Her husband reached for her hand, breaking her from her thoughts. "Let's just focus on the trip, okay? Let's get through this and we'll talk about it later." She nodded, grateful for his support. She needed to move on, if only for the moment. She didn't wow. The flight was uneventful, and for a moment the woman tried to forget the events of the morning. She sat by the window, her eyes occasionally drifting to the clouds outside, trying to lose herself in the calm of the sky. Her husband sat beside her, reading a book, but she could tell from the occasional glance in her direction that he was still thinking about what had happened. They both were. When they arrived at their destination, the woman tried to push everything from her mind. The conference was important, and she didn't want to let the incident at the airport overshadow what they had traveled for. She knew it would be hard to shake off, but she tried her best to focus on the work ahead. As they made their way to the hotel, she kept up a conversation with her husband, though her thoughts were often elsewhere. She could still hear the officer's words in her head, the way he had scrutinized her, the way he had made her feel like an outsider. Her husband was aware of her silence, but didn't press her to talk. He understood that she needed space to process everything in her own time. He could tell that the apology from the supervisor hadn't eased her pain. It wasn't just the questioning at the airport. It was the feeling of being invisible, of having her worth reduced to a stereotype. Her identity had been dismissed so casually, and that hurt more than anything. They checked into the hotel and settled into their room. The conference wasn't until the next morning, and they had a few hours to themselves before the events began. The woman stood by the window gazing out at the city below, the bustling streets below in stark contrast to the quiet inside the hotel room. Her husband joined her at the window, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. She shook her head, though the weight in her chest made it hard to hold back the emotions she had been holding in. "I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice low. Her husband didn't push. He just stood beside her, offering her the space she needed. After a few minutes, she turned to him, her face a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I feel like I'm stuck," she admitted. "Like I'm constantly being treated like I'm not enough. Not enough to be on my own. Not enough to travel without suspicion. Not enough to just be myself." Her husband's expression softened as he pulled her into a gentle hug. "You are more than enough. Don't let what happened make you feel small. You have every right to be here just like anyone else." I know, but it's not about rights. It's about how I'm seen. It's about how people automatically think they know who I am just by looking at me. I can't escape that. She pulled back slightly, looking at him. I want to believe it's all going to be okay, but sometimes it feels like I'm fighting a battle I can't win. He took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. You're not fighting it alone, and you've been fighting it for years, even when you didn't realize it. But that's not the same as losing. It's just a different kind of fight. It's hard. I get that. But you've always been strong. I see it every day. She smiled faintly, touched by his words. Thank you, she whispered. They spent the evening in the hotel room, unwinding in their own ways. She did her best to let the city's energy seep into her, to stop thinking about the airport incident. But as the night wore on, the weight of everything came crashing back. There were moments when she thought the next few days in the city were a blur. The woman did her best to keep her focus on the conference, trying to push the events of the airport out of her mind. But there were moments when it all came rushing back. The way the officer had looked at her, the way he had treated her like she didn't belong, still stung. And it wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was the system that allowed it to happen. The subtle way people like her were made to feel like outsiders. The weight of that realization was heavy, and no matter how much she tried to distract herself, it was always there, lingering in the background. Her husband could see the change in her. He noticed the way her smile didn't reach her eyes sometimes, the way her shoulders tensed up when someone made an offhand remark, the way she'd look off into the distance, lost in thought. He tried to be there for her, but he also knew that some battles couldn't be fought in just a few days. She needed time to process everything, to work through it in her own way, and while he wanted to help her find closure, he also knew that she had to find her own path to healing. One afternoon, as the conference was winding down, they found themselves with a few hours to kill before their evening flight. The woman suggested they take a walk around the city, something to clear her mind. Her husband agreed, and they set off, wandering through the streets, talking about anything and everything. They found a quiet park, tucked away from the noise of the city, and sat on a bench taking in the view of the trees and the sky above them. For the first time in days, the woman felt at ease. The park was peaceful, and the world felt far removed from the chaos of the airport. She watched as a group of children ran past, laughing, their carefree energy reminding her of the simplicity of childhood. It was in moments like these that she realized how much she had been carrying with her, how much the weight of that single incident had affected her. But here in this moment she felt lighter. The park had a way of quieting the noise in her head, of reminding her that there were still beautiful things in the world. I never realized how much I needed this, she said softly, looking over at her husband. It's so easy to get caught up in everything. The stress, the expectations, the judgment. Sometimes it feels like there's no way out. Her husband nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. It's a lot to carry, but you're strong. You've always been strong. And it's okay to feel what you're feeling. It's okay to not have everything figured out. The woman took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. I keep thinking about the airport, about what that officer said, how he made me feel like I wasn't enough. And it's not just that one moment. It's everything that comes with it. The way people look at me, the way they assume things about me before they even know me. It's like they've already decided who I am and I don't get a chance to show them anything else. Her husband's hand found hers, squeezing it gently. You don't need anyone else's approval to know who you are. You've built a life, a career, a future on your own terms, and that's what matters, not what someone else thinks of you. I know, she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty, but sometimes it's hard to remember that. When you're constantly made to feel like you're less than, it's easy to start believing it. I want to be strong, but I also want to be seen for who I really am. Not just the color of my skin, not just the way I look. Her husband was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. You are seen by me, by the people who love and respect you, and I know it's hard, but you can't let the opinions of people who don't know you define who you are. She nodded slowly, grateful for his words, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she could just let it go. She had been fighting this fight for so long, and it wasn't something that could be solved in a few days or even a few months. It was a fight that would last her whole life, and that reality felt heavy. It wasn't just about this one encounter. It was the cumulative weight of every other time she had been made to feel small, to feel invisible simply because of who she was. As they sat there in silence, the woman's mind drifted to the larger picture. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, to prove herself in spaces where people didn't always expect her to succeed. She had worked late nights, taken on challenges that others had shied away from, and pushed herself beyond her limits to make sure she could stand on her own. But no matter how much she achieved, no matter how hard she worked, there was always that invisible barrier, the one that told her she wasn't enough. That told her she had to prove herself over and over again. "I've been thinking," her husband said, breaking her from her thoughts. "Maybe it's time for us to do something about it. Not just sit back and accept things as they are. Maybe it's time for us to start talking about these experiences, about what people like you and me face every day. Maybe it's time to start sharing our stories." She looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. "Share our stories? How?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we start small. Maybe we share our story with people who don't understand, people who don't realize the impact of their words and actions. Maybe we raise awareness in our own way, so others don't have to go through the same thing." The idea took root in her mind. She had always been the type to keep things to herself, to avoid confrontation, to stay under the radar. But what if he was right? What if the way forward wasn't just about surviving, but about speaking up, about using her voice to create change? The thought scared her, but it also sparked something inside her. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. And this, she realized, was another challenge, one that could make a difference not just for her but for others as well. "You're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to stop being silent and start speaking up." Her husband smiled, the kind of smile that told her he was proud of her. "I believe in you," he said simply. As they made their way back to the hotel, the woman felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the airport incident hadn't disappeared, but now she saw it differently. It wasn't just a personal injustice, it was a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to be part of that change. She didn't know exactly what it would look like, but she knew it was the right path. She didn't have to fight this battle alone. With her husband by her side, with the support of people who understood, she could make a difference. And that thought, that sense of empowerment, was enough to keep her moving forward. He might have pushed it aside for good, but they always came rushing back. The officer's face, the way he had looked at her, the dismissive tone in his voice, the questioning, the judgment, it was all still there, lingering. The next morning, the conference began, and the days that followed were a mix of reflection and action. The woman had spent the last few days thinking about everything that had happened, the airport encounter, the way she had been treated, and the feelings of helplessness that had followed. But now there was a sense of clarity. The weight of it hadn't entirely disappeared, but it had sparked something inside her, a desire to do more than just accept the way things were. It was time to speak out, to share her story, to make sure others didn't have to face the same kind of injustice. She and her husband had talked it over for hours, discussing how best to approach the situation. It wasn't about confrontation for the sake of confrontation. It was about raising awareness. It was about helping others understand the impact of their actions and words, showing them how small moments of discrimination could make someone feel less than human. She had never been the type to seek the spotlight, but now she felt a responsibility to do something, anything that could make a difference. Her husband had been a source of support throughout all of this, always there to listen and offer advice. He had suggested reaching out to a local community group that focused on racial justice and sharing her story with them. At first, she hesitated. Speaking up was never easy, especially when it meant reliving painful moments. But she knew deep down that her story could help others, and if she could make even the smallest impact, it would be worth it. One afternoon, after a long day of work, they sat down together in their hotel room. The woman had spent most of the day thinking about how to start, what to say, and where to begin. Her husband had already done some research and found a few local organizations that could help guide her. He handed her his laptop and they began to scroll through the websites together. They found a community group that had a platform for people to share their stories, a place where voices like hers could be heard. At first, she was overwhelmed. The thought of sharing something so personal, something that had hurt her so deeply, felt like a huge step. She had always kept things to herself, never wanting to burden anyone with her struggles. But now she knew that silence wasn't the answer. Silence allowed the injustice to continue unchecked, and it prevented change from happening. Her husband saw the hesitation in her eyes and gently placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. "If you're ready, I'll be here every step of the way." She looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. He had been by her side through everything, offering unwavering support. She wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long time she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the way forward, not just for her but for others who had been through similar experiences. With a deep breath, she clicked on the link to share her story. It wasn't easy. The words didn't come quickly, and she found herself pausing many times to collect her thoughts. But she kept going. She wrote about the incident at the airport, about the officer's questions, the judgment she had felt and the impact it had on her. She shared how it wasn't just about that one moment. It was about all the moments that had led up to it. It was about the constant feeling of being scrutinized, of being treated as if she was somehow less than everyone else. She wrote about the frustration of being stereotyped, of having her worth questioned before she even had a chance to show who she really was. She wrote about the small moments of daily discrimination that people like her faced without even realizing it, how the world often saw her through a lens of assumptions and biases. As she wrote, the words began to flow more freely. She could feel the weight lifting from her shoulders, the burden of silence finally being released. She realized that sharing her story wasn't just about calling out the wrongs she had faced. It was about finding her voice, about taking back control of her narrative. It was about refusing to let others define her, to let them decide who she was and what she was capable of. When she finished, she read through the words again, making sure they captured everything she wanted to say. There were moments when her emotions threatened to take over, but she pushed through. This was her truth, and it needed to be told. It wasn't just her story. It was the story of so many others who had faced similar struggles, who had been made to feel invisible, unworthy, or like they didn't belong. Her husband sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders as she hit the submit button. She took a deep breath, feeling both nervous and relieved. She had shared her truth with the world, and now it was out there. She couldn't take it back, but she didn't want to. This was the first step toward change, not just for her, but for everyone who had been through something similar. Over the next few days, she received messages from people all over. Some were strangers, others were friends, all of them offering their support and gratitude for sharing her story. Some people shared their own experiences, telling her how they too had faced similar discrimination, how they too had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. It was humbling, and in some ways it was overwhelming. But it also made her realize that she wasn't alone. There were so many people out there who had been through what she had, who understood the pain and the frustration of being treated unfairly. She began to connect with some of the people who had reached out, joining conversations and learning about their experiences. She found strength in their stories, in their resilience, and in the shared commitment to making the world a better place. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But she knew that change was possible. It started with people like her, people who were willing to speak up, to share their truth, and to demand better. In the weeks that followed, the woman found herself getting more involved in the community group. She attended meetings, participated in events, and began to speak out more about the issues that mattered to her. The experience had sparked a fire within her, a desire to do more, to be more. She didn't want to just be a passive observer of change. She wanted to be an active participant. Her husband was with her every step of the way. He supported her when she felt overwhelmed, encouraged her when she doubted herself, and celebrated every small victory along the way. They were partners in this journey, and together they were making a difference. She could see it in the conversations they were having, in the way people were starting to listen, and in the way they were beginning to challenge the status quo. The airport incident was still a painful memory, but it had become a catalyst for something bigger. She had turned that pain into action, using her voice to create change. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, she was ready to keep fighting, ready to keep pushing for a world where everyone was seen for who they truly were, not just for the assumptions others made about them. As she looked ahead, she realized that her journey was far from over, but now she was no longer fighting it alone. She had found her voice, and she was using it to make a difference, and that made all the difference in the world. For a while, she focused on the tasks at hand. She found herself walking around the conference center, exchanging pleasantries with other professionals and trying to stay present in the moment. It wasn't easy. There were flashes of the airport incident, the feeling of being judged, of being made to feel less than. It wasn't just the officer who had made her feel that way. It was the entire system that allowed it to happen. The day passed by quickly, though the woman could tell her husband. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences and challenges. The woman had found herself in a space that felt both unfamiliar and empowering. Speaking out about her experiences had opened up a new chapter in her life, one that was filled with growth, understanding, and action. She had no idea how much sharing her story would impact not just her, but so many others around her. The outpouring of support had been overwhelming, and it made her realize how powerful it was to be seen and heard. At first, she had been hesitant to take such a bold step. But as the messages of encouragement poured in, it became clear that she was part of something much bigger than herself. She wasn't just sharing her own truth. She was giving others the courage to do the same. Her story had become a part of a larger conversation about discrimination, identity, and the need for change. It was a conversation she hadn't fully realized she was a part of until it began to unfold around her. Her husband had watched her evolve over the past few weeks, seeing her transform from someone who had been weighed down by the effects of that one encounter at the airport to someone who was actively working toward change. He couldn't have been prouder of her. He saw the way she carried herself now, with a renewed sense of purpose and strength. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, even in the face of the challenges that came with speaking out. Together, they had attended community meetings, connected with other like-minded individuals, and shared their experiences. Each conversation was a step forward. Each story that was shared was a piece of the puzzle that brought them closer to the world they hoped to create. A world where everyone, regardless of their background, could walk through life without fear of being judged or diminished by others. One evening, as they sat in their hotel room after another meeting, her husband turned to her with a thoughtful look on his face. "You've come so far," he said quietly. "I can see the difference in you. You've taken something that was so painful and turned it into something powerful. You're helping others by sharing your truth. It's incredible." The woman smiled softly, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "I never imagined it would have this impact. At first, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't silent anymore. But now it feels like I'm part of something bigger. It feels like I'm making a difference." "You are," her husband replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've inspired so many people, including me. I'm so proud of you." She didn't know how to respond to that. There was so much she wanted to say, but the words seemed to escape her. She had spent so many years fighting to prove herself, to be seen for who she truly was, that now, when people were seeing her for the first time, not for the color of her skin, but for the person she was both overwhelmed and humbled. She had never expected this kind of response, and yet, here she was using her voice to create change. The journey had been long, and it wasn't over. There were still so many people who didn't understand, so many who would still look at her and others like her through a lens of prejudice. The work was far from finished, but now she felt equipped to handle whatever came her way. She had found her voice, and that made all the difference. Her involvement in the community group had deepened over the past few weeks. She had been invited to speak at several local events where she shared her experiences and talked about the importance of empathy and understanding. The more she spoke, the more she realized how important it was to break down the barriers between people, to help others understand that the pain of one person was felt by many. The woman had been moved by the stories she heard at the meetings. She had met people from all walks of life, people who had faced their own struggles, who had been made to feel small or invisible because of who they were. Listening to their stories had made her realize that her experiences were not isolated. They were a reflection of a larger issue, one that required change, one that required all of them to stand up together. One particular event stood out to her. It was a community gathering held at a local park, where people from different backgrounds came together to share their stories and offer support. The event was meant to be a peaceful demonstration, a way to show solidarity and raise awareness about racial injustice. She had agreed to speak at the event, something that still made her nervous. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, but she knew this was important. As she stood at the front of the crowd, her heart pounded in her chest. The park was filled with people, families, friends, neighbors, each person there because they believed in change. She looked out at the sea of faces and felt a wave of gratitude. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for all those who had felt silenced, who had been told their voices didn't matter. Her husband stood by her side, offering silent support as she took a deep breath and began to speak. "I'm here today because I believe in change," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves. "I believe in the power of our voices. I believe that when we share our stories, when we stand together, we create something stronger than any injustice. And I believe that each one of us, no matter where we come from, has the power to make a difference." As she spoke, she could feel the weight of everything she had been through, but it wasn't the same weight that had held her down before. This weight felt lighter. It felt like the kind of weight that only comes when you're standing up for what's right. She shared her experience at the airport not as a victim, but as someone who had found strength in the face of adversity. She talked about the importance of understanding, of compassion, and of the need to listen to those who had been marginalized. When she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence before the crowd erupted in applause. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, and for the first time in a long time she felt seen, not just by her husband, not just by the people who had supported her, but by the community. She had taken a stand, and now others were standing with her. The applause was overwhelming, but it wasn't the applause that moved her the most. It was the faces in the crowd, the way people were nodding, the way they were looking at her with a mixture of respect and understanding. It was the realization that she had connected with them, that her words had resonated. She wasn't alone. They weren't alone, and together they could make a difference. As the event came to a close, her husband took her hand, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it," he said softly. "You spoke your truth and people listened." She smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, squeezing his hand. Over the next few months, the woman continued to share her story, to speak out, and to stand up for what she believed in. She became an active member of the community group, helping to organize events, raise awareness, and create a space where people could share their experiences. The work was far from easy, but it was rewarding in ways she hadn't imagined. And in those quiet moments when she thought about everything she had been through, she realized something. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, for everyone who had been judged before they had a chance to speak. She was fighting for a world where people could walk through life without the fear of being made to feel small, and as long as she had her voice, she would continue to fight and was aware of her struggle. He kept an eye on her, and when they had breaks, he would check in to make sure she was okay. He knew it wasn't easy for her. The truth was, it wasn't easy for him either. He hated seeing her go through something like this. He had always admired her strength, her ability to face challenges head-on. But this was different. This wasn't just a minor setback. It was an attack on her dignity, on her humanity. And he couldn't just let it go either. After the final panel of the day, they decided to take a walk through the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue across the skyline. The air was crisp, and for the first time since the airport, the woman felt a little lighter. She walked beside her husband, allowing the cool breeze to ease the tension in her shoulders. They didn't speak much during the walk, but the silence felt comforting, not uncomfortable. It was a chance for both of them to collect their thoughts and breathe without feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. They stopped at a small cafe, and for a few hours, they allowed themselves to forget about the larger issues, to just be in the moment. They shared stories, talked about their day, and laughed. The city seemed so far away from the tension of the airport. For a brief time, the woman let herself forget about the officer's words and the feeling of being judged. She wanted to keep that feeling as long as she could. As they sat together, sipping their drinks, her husband looked at her with a serious expression. "You know, I've been thinking," he began, his voice softer now. "What happened at the airport isn't just your fight. It's everyone's fight. The way you were treated, it's part of something bigger. I can't change the past, but I can stand by you. And I will." Every step of the way, her heart swelled with emotion. She had always known her husband supported her, but hearing him say those words out loud made her feel seen, made her feel like she wasn't alone in this fight. It wasn't just about them, it was about standing up for what was right together. She realized that even though the fight felt exhausting, she didn't have to carry it on her own. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. "I appreciate you," she said quietly, looking into his eyes. "I don't know how I'd get through this without you." He smiled, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to do it alone." They finished their drinks, the city lights flickering around them as they walked back to the hotel. The woman felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from pretending everything was fine. It was a different kind of calm. The kind that came from knowing that she had someone by her side, someone who understood. Someone who didn't just stand by her in good times but stood with her in the hard times, too. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how she was going to handle everything that was still ahead, but she knew that together they could face anything, and that gave her the strength to keep going. Tita let this incident define her trip, but she knew deep down that it would stay with her, lingering in the background. No matter how much she tried to push it out of her mind, the truth was that this was just one of many similar experiences. She wasn't the first person to be treated unfairly, and she wouldn't be the last. As they sat down at the gate, she tried to push aside the feeling of injustice. She took a deep breath, focusing on the fact that the flight was on time and that her husband was right beside her. The trip wasn't over yet, but as they settled in, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of resolve. She wasn't going to let this experience be the one thing that defined her day. She was stronger than that. And though she couldn't erase what had happened, she could control how she responded to it. She glanced at her husband, who gave her a reassuring smile. And for the first time that day, she felt a little lighter. They were in this together, and no matter what happened next, she knew she wasn't alone. "Tap in. Everything's fine," he replied curtly, his eyes narrowing slightly. But the doubt in his voice was obvious. The woman's husband turned to the officer, his gaze steady. "It doesn't seem fine. You've been questioning my wife for quite a while now. Is there a reason for this? We've been through security plenty of times before without any issues." The officer's eyes flicked back and forth between the husband and the woman, the tension thickening in the air. "I'm just doing my job," the officer said, but there was a noticeable defensiveness in his tone now. "If you have a problem with how things are going, I can call a supervisor." The husband looked at him unfazed. "I think we should speak to a supervisor. I'm not comfortable with how my wife is being treated right now." The officer's posture stiffened, and he called over a supervisor, his voice more controlled now. The woman felt a mix of relief and anxiety wash over her. At least someone would be looking into this now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As they waited for the supervisor to arrive, the woman couldn't help but think about the countless times she had been made to feel less than, as if she didn't belong simply because of her appearance. She had faced racism before, but this time it felt personal, and she knew this would be a moment she would never forget.